presentation. And before I introduce our speaker today, just a quick reminder, if you sign up on the Google Sheet, please put a check mark that you are here in the room, and if you haven't signed you electronically, just write in your name on the same list. So the difference in procedures is we have only one list starting this week. Last week we had two separate lists, but now we're going to have only one. Okay, this is my greatest pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Julia Behrman. Julia is an assistant professor in sociology at Northwestern University, and she has received her PhD at NYU in 2017, and prior joining Northwestern, Julia was a postdoctoral prize research fellow in sociology at Northfield College at the University of Oxford. Julia's research investigates the causes and consequences of family change from a global perspective. Her research explores how the institution of the family shapes and is shaped by key social phenomena in the following areas: educational expansion, environmental change, natural disaster and climate shocks, expansion of women labor force participation, and migration. So much of her work is motivated by the questions of power. For instance, who has power within families and how is power manifested within families? What events or experiences lead to changes in power dynamics within families? Julia's research has received funding from the National Science Foundation on a grant that focuses on understanding migration and fertility, and she has also received research from the South African Medical Research Council Sexual Violence Research Initiative. And beyond this, her work has also received several awards from the American Sociological Association, sections on education, population and development, the Society for the Study of Social Problems, the PA, and the Sociologist ACE Network. Will this please join me in welcoming Julia?
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So thank you so much for having me. Thanks for the introduction. And yeah, this is my first time presenting in person in a very long time. So it's both exciting and a little nerve-wracking. But I'm going to jump in, and I think Liliana gave a great sort of overview of my broader research interests. And the starting point of what I'm going to talk about today really piggybacks on what she said, and is thinking about some of the dramatic sort of changes we've seen in family life over the last 70, 80 years, and really in a diverse array of settings. So I've chosen a few different indicators to put up here just to highlight a few trends. So growing share of households that are single parent across a fairly diverse array of settings, declines in marriage. But there are many other things we could have looked at. We could have looked at rising single person households, changing patterns of divorce, fertility, and so on. And the questions that really motivate my work are related to, when and why do family norms change? Conversely, when do they not change, when we might expect them to? And what are the implications of these changes for inequalities both within families, so within generations or between spouses, but also between families? Thinking from a more conventional stratification perspective. And a lot of my past work has focused on sub-Saharan Africa and normative contexts where there's preference for very high family size. So, obviously there are a lot of people here working on these questions in sub-Saharan Africa who are probably well aware, with these very high TFRs consistently above the world average. And a lot of my work has focused on sort of these large, normative context of high fertility as a starting point to ask questions about, how and why do preferences for large family size decline? What role do things like mass education or urbanization or changing climate play in shaping family norms, and also, who is having more children than they desire. But I'm actually going to switch gears today and talk about a different project, a very new project. And so, with that in mind, I'll be very excited to get people's feedback. And instead of focusing on this normative context of preference for large families, I'm looking at the U.S. And so somewhere characterized by a normative context of replacement level fertility. So I'm sure, people in this room are very familiar with these TFR trends for the U.S., where we see, since the 1970s, fairly stable replacement level fertility, albeit with this more recent fall. And the U.S. has been for some time, been characterized by, a so-called two-child norm. And often we think about measuring norms with things such as questions about people's ideal family size or their preferred number of children. And these types of questions were first introduced in Gallup opinion polling in the 1930s. And there's been this sort of steady preference for two children that really gained prominence between the mid-1960s and the early 1970s and endured to the early 2000s when in this Haywood and Morgan article, they find evidence that there's a remarkably persuasive desire and supporting norm for a family size of 2 children. And so in spite of this evidence of sort of endurance in the early 2000s and some indication of persistence in opinion polling, I sort of came to this question, thinking about what has happened since the early 2000s. So we know that birth rates in the U.S. have been falling continuously for the last decade and have, declined to below replacement levels. And there's been a lot of attention to this in the news media and the types of articles I have up here. Certainly this has been aggravated by the pandemic, but was also happening before the pandemic. So, the thing that I started wondering is, in light of what we've been seeing, has there actually been any type of corresponding change in people's preferences? And, how might this relate to this bigger question of this sort of two-child norm? And I think there are 2 reasons to think that a decline in this sort of quote-unquote two-child norm might matter. So the first is, fear of what's often called fear of sort of a low fertility trap. So the idea that once preferences drop below replacement level and low fertility becomes normative, then it's very difficult for fertility to rebound. So, once norms change, it's very hard for behavior to readjust. And there's been a lot of debate in China and also in Europe about the extent to which we should or shouldn't be worried about such a thing. But arguably, I think that's, a first reason we might really care about why preferences are changing. And the second has to do with literature that's increasingly focused on unrealized fertility. So if norms don't change, if people still have preference, for 2 or 3 children, but fertility does drop, then what happens? And who is it that's having fewer children than they want? And could this be sort of a new arena of reproductive stratification? And I'm particularly interested when thinking about, the question of a decline in this two-child norm is if there are any cohort differences in this decline. So I'm particularly interested in this project about thinking about whether things might look different for millennials. So for those born in 1981, 1996, and how this might compare to older generations. And there are 2 sort of distinct reasons why I'm interested in focusing on millennials. And the first rationale for thinking that there might be a decline in this two-child norm among millennials is economics. So, there's been a lot of attention to the economic status of millennials. A lot of it has been, a lot of the news, media attention is quite dramatic. But we do know that millennials, so especially millennial men, they're not transitioning into the labor market as successfully as prior generations. We know there's been sort of a sharp reduction in the quality of jobs that both men and women in the millennial generation have taken at age 30. And more than any other generation, we know that millennials have been sort of profoundly affected by the Great Recession. And so they have higher student debts, lower young adult home ownership, and also larger racial gaps in home ownership compared to older generations. So, it stands to reason that perhaps constrained economic outcomes would lead to less demand for children along millennials, and we might see sort of a corresponding shift in preferences. So the second reason why I think, we may see a decline in fertility preferences among millennials is more sort of sociocultural in orientation. So this is building off of the predictions of the second demographic transition. So, this idea that there should be a shift in attitudes and norms towards individuality, self-actualization, that corresponds with low fertility. And there's been a lot of debates about the applicability of the second demographic transition framework in the US, but I think certainly some aspects of it we do see increasingly in younger cohorts. So compared to older generations, millennials are more likely to have gender egalitarian views. They're more likely to be accepting of sort of different family forms and more secular. And it's possible that this could also translate into the type of lower fertility preferences predicted by the second demographic transition, particularly if people are sort of putting their individualized experiences ahead of eventual family formation. So the first question that I look at empirically is just a very simple descriptive exercise to see if there's been a decline in this, so-called two-child norm among millennials compared to older cohorts. And I do this using two different sources of data. And so here I'm looking at two common measures that are used to capture this two-child norm. So first, a question about ideal family size in the General Social Survey. So what do you think is the ideal number of children for a family to have? And the second source is from the National Survey of Family Growth. And this is a question about intended family size that's constructed out of information about current family size and intention for future births. And these are both nationally representative microdata. In both cases, I'm using survey data from the early 80s onward. And I just want to note, I think when we're thinking about measuring this ideal unintended family size, it raises a lot of really interesting questions about the linkages between the individual and the group and sort of insights into some of the bigger debates in sociology. What do reported preferences reflect? Do they reflect individual ideas or sort of broader social norms? Do norms shape behavior, or do people use norms to justify behavior? And I think these are really important questions that I'll kind of be grappling through throughout the presentation. And I'm sort of using ideals here of both, relevant reflections of broader social norms and perhaps imperfect predictors of behavior, but certainly useful ones. And I want to also suggest that I certainly don't think that ideal family size is stable. There's this famous analogy of ideal family size as a moving target, and something that's flexible or malleable and changes over the life course. So that's something, to keep in mind throughout the presentation. So this is the sample I'm working with for this first question about whether there's been declines in ideal and intended family size. So we have the 3 cohorts of interest here and sample sizes from both the GSF and the MSFG. So I start just by doing a very simple descriptive exercise where I look at whether the predicted counts of ideal and intended family size differ by cohort to see if there has been evidence of the type of decline that I would predict based on the reasons I suggested. And what I find is actually contrary to my expectations when I set out on this. So as I said, I suspected that we would see a fall among millennials, which are the group furthest on the right. And if anything, we actually see a small, very small, but it's there, increase. And so overall, there's really remarkable consistency in ideal family size at about 2.5. And if we include intended family size as well, we see similar consistency. So though intended family size is lower than ideal, which is what we would expect probably by and large, there is a remarkable consistency across cohorts, and B, both of these measures remain high in the 2.5 range. Now, of course, we know there are a number of differences between these groups. Perhaps most importantly, there are differences in the age structure. We know that so the millennials on average are in the 20s at survey, whereas the other groups are a bit older. So it could be that some of this consistency between cohorts is just reflecting these age differences, particularly if younger people have higher fertility preferences at earlier ages. So to address this, in the next set of estimates, I re-weight the older cohorts to resemble millennials on age, and then re-estimate these predicted counts. And what I find here is, by and large, so there are now significantly lower intentions among baby boomers compared to the other groups. But still, by and large, there is remarkable consistency over cohorts in ideal and intended family size that suggests that it's not just these differences in age structure that are driving this continuity. And of course, this far, I've been talking about the cohort as a group, but we know that there's a lot of important heterogeneity in many respects. And so the next thing I look at is predicted counts by race ethnicity. And so that's what I'm showing in this figure here. And there are a few things to note. So once again, and this is just looking at ideals because the intentions look fairly similar, but I find that overall ideals are fairly high among all 3 groups. So ranging from about 2.4 to 2.8. That being said, ideals are consistently higher among Black and Hispanic respondents, so across all 3 cohorts, compared to white respondents. There's a fair amount. I also break this out by gender and race ethnicity, and there's a lot of within racial and ethnic categories. There's no significant differences between men and women, which is why I'm not presenting those estimates here. So this raises questions as well. I think the fact that there are some differences by race and ethnic background is perhaps compositional changes in race and ethnicity between the cohorts might explain some of the stability And in addition to, potential changes in the racial and ethnic breakdown, we might think there are other important changes. So changes in marriage, particularly with rising ages of marriage, or education, and so on. So the next thing I do is reweight the older cohorts to resemble millennials on age, but also on race, ethnicity, on marital status, on education. And once again, I'm seeing a fair amount of similarity across the three cohorts, which suggests that these differences in composition are not explaining this stability. So far, in what I've shown, I see no kind of evidence of decline in the two-child norm. There seems to be remarkable continuity in millennials compared to other cohorts. And so, there's limited evidence to support the fears that declining fertility ideals might become some sort of a low fertility trap in the context of younger cohorts in the U.S. And the thing that I wondered coming out of this is what about major events that we would expect might impact this continuity? And here I'm wondering in particular about the Great Recession. So we know that the Great Recession really profoundly impacted millennials. So I mentioned that a bit at the start of the talk. So they were financially impacted. It also, hit during prime reproductive years. We know the Great Recession led to a host of changes in family life. There were doubling up of households, people put off divorces, and so on. And we have a fair amount of evidence suggesting that the Great Recession had a negative impact on fertility, but we know less about how it impacted people's fertility preferences. So the next question I look at is whether the Great Recession impacted ideal family size. And I think there are three different reasons why this question matters. So the first relates to this concept of unrealized fertility that I talked about in the beginning. So if the Great Recession did not affect fertility preferences, but did affect fertility, then this opens up, questions about whether this major event sort of aggravated unrealized fertility. The second reason I think this question is important is because it could provide some insight into, whether the negative effects of economic shocks on fertility are short or long term. So there's some debate on this question. So there's some scholars who suggest that shocks impact timing, but not the quantum of childbearing. Other scholarship suggests that economic shocks can, in fact, have a lasting impact on quantum, depending on when in the life course they're experienced. So if we do see an impact of something like the Great Recession on fertility, this could provide some indication of potential longer-term impacts. And finally, I think this question sort of contributes to understanding of how and why social norms around family change. So we know that ideals can evolve quickly in times of rapid change. At the same time, there was a lot of within cohort heterogeneity in experiences of the Great Recession. So it could be that effects are concentrated among those most affected. So to look at this question about how the Great Recession impacted fertility preferences, I take advantage of the fact that the GSS had a rotating panel that took place before, during, and after the Great Recession. And here I'm using a within-person fixed effects approach. So I'm using people as their own controls, when they're interviewed before, during, and after. And of course, the advantage of this within-person fixed effects approach is that it addresses for time invariant confounders, things like cognitive ability or family background. And of course, there are many time variant confounders that may be impacted by something like the Great Recession. And so I include a number of time-varying controls for things like income, employment, and so on. And I look at two different outcomes. So the first one is seemingly a little unrelated. So the first one is an outcome about whether your financial situation has worsened in the last few years. And I look at this outcome as sort of a validation of the measure, so to show that the treatment of the Great Recession is actually affecting financial status in the way we would think, but also because this might be a potential mechanism. And then the second one is this question about ideal family size. That is the same as what I looked at in the descriptive exercise. So what I'm showing here are a plot of the regression coefficient in this within-person fixed effect analysis of the effect of the Great Recession on people's self-reports of their financial status. And the reference here is the interviews before the recession. These are estimated as linear probability models, I should say. So what we see is that people interviewed during the recession had a 13 percentage point, higher probability of reporting a worsened financial situation compared to when they were interviewed beforehand. And those interviewed after the Great Recession had a 20 percentage point higher probability of reporting a worsened financial situation compared to these pre-recession interviews. So by and large, this sort of validates this measure and suggests that the Great Recession did indeed have a big impact on people's financial well-being, at least in self-reports. So with this in hand, I move into this next question about whether the Great Recession impacted ideal family size. And once again, these are the plots of the regression coefficients. And the things to note here is that although we do see a positive coefficient, but it's quite small, and there are no significant differences between those interviewed during compared to before, or those interviewed after compared to before. So that being said, there are a few instances when there's heterogeneity that I'll just mention in passing. So there is a significant negative interaction between unemployment and the Great Recession for women, and there is some positive effect of being interviewed during the Great Recession on ideal family size for women who were ages 35 to 39 at the start of the recession. So from everything I've shown up to this point, it points in many respects, I would say, to sort of this enduring stability of this two-child norm. So we saw continuity in ideal and intended family size across cohorts. And even though we know there was this negative effect of the Great Recession on fertility, at least in the short term, there seemed to be limited impacts on people's ideal family size, and to the extent they're concentrated among, very specific groups who are directly affected. So, those who changed employment status or those at the end of childbearing. But what I want to do next is sort of dig a bit deeper and raise the possibility that it's possible that preference for two children might mean something different for millennials than it does for those in older cohorts. And I think this is sort of particularly relevant in light of a lot of sort of the changing views on gender and family that I described below. So, the deinstitutionalization of marriage, the second demographic transition, and so on. And so in the next part of the analysis, what I really look at is whether sort of the social meaning of this two-child norm has changed. And in doing so, I'm situating family size preferences as part of a broader system of family ideology that encompasses changing gender norms, but also things like religiosity, attitudes about family, and so on. And to do this, I'm using a latent class approach. So this allows me to look at whether there are sort of multiple typologies of two-child norms and whether they've changed over cohorts. And so latent class approaches identify sort of qualitatively different unobserved classes of respondents based on their observed characteristics, and through a process of assigning different classes based on membership probabilities estimated from an underlying model. And to do this, I'm using cross-sectional GSS data from 1985 onwards. So 1985 is the year when sort of the questions that I'm interested in start being widely asked. And I have a sample of just over 5,000 respondents. And I have good representation from each of the three cohorts. And what I'm doing is hypothesizing that there are sort of different latent constructs of two-child norms comprised of observed measures of ideal family size, which is one of the observed measures I have and that I've discussed before, but also norms related to gender and family, to religiosity, and so on. So these are the observed measures I look at. And other than the ideal family size measure, they're all binary, and they're all coded so that a response of 1 reflects sort of the more, quote-unquote traditional view, and a response of 0 reflects the less traditional view, so the one that would be more perhaps consistent with second demographic transition. And they cover a range of different characteristics related to compatibility of work and family, preference for male breadwinner model, gender essentialism, religiosity, and so on. And the first step in the latent class is to select the number of classes based on the model fit. So I'm going to kind of rush through that step and not show all the fit statistics, but what I find is that a 4-class model fits the data best. And the second step is to assign respondents to a latent class based on their sort of probability of class membership, and then to calculate the proportion of the sample in each of the predicted classes. And so what I find is in this 4-class model is about 3 of the 4 classes fit in this two-child range, so ranging between 2 and 2.5 ideal children. And these 3 classes comprise about 95% of the sample. So there is this 4th class that comprises about 5% of the sample that has much higher fertility, so prefers between 4 and 5 children. But there is some interesting heterogeneity between these first 3 classes. And I've given them the names that are listed on the slide, and I want to walk a little bit through what these different names represent and how these different classes differ from each other. So this is a lot of information on one slide, but I will try and walk through it clearly. So what this slide is showing are the marginal probabilities of responding positively to each of the observed measures for the respondents in a given class. So for this first group of this first class in sort of the upper left-hand corner, the ones that I call 2 or 2+ child progressives. So this class comprises about 41% of the sample. And this is the class that's sort of most consistent with the second demographic transition. So this class, by and large, rejects the male breadwinner model. They exhibit much lower levels of religiosity compared to the other classes. And they reject the idea that work and family are incompatible for women. That being said, I think it's worth noting that even within this class that has the lowest level of religiosity, 25% of its members report praying quite frequently. So this is, a little different than perhaps what would be strictly speaking predicted by the second demographic transition. So this second class, so the class to the right in the purple, is what I call the two-child traditional class. So this class is in many ways the polar opposite of this progressive class. So they express preference for a male breadwinner, female homemaker model of the family. They express concern that work and family are incompatible for women. They express high levels of religiosity and support for preventing abortion and premarital sex and so on. The third class, if we move to the left-hand side of the lower quadrant, also expresses a preference for two to coincide children. And I call this the mixed class. So this class is a mix of the first two groups. So they express, by and large, gender progressive ideas on work and family incompatibility and so on. But they also express higher levels of religiosity and less support for abortion or premarital sex. And then this final class, the 4 to 5 children, is similar to the traditional class in many respects, although they have a higher preference for ideal number of children. So in the third and final step of this latent class analysis, I explore the demographic characteristics that predict class membership using multimodal logistic regression. And here what I'm plotting are the predicted probabilities of class membership, calculated following the multimodal logic. And what we see by and large is an increase in the predicted probability of being in the two-child progressive category over cohorts, so that about 40% of baby boomers are in this category compared to 60% of millennials. There's also a decline away from the traditional class membership, and which corresponds with this as well. That being said, there's still quite a bit of heterogeneity, I would say, within the millennials, and we see even more heterogeneity when we break it down by race and ethnicity. So among the millennials, which are in the quadrant on the right, so we see that across race and ethnic groups, in millennials, people have a higher predicted probability of being in this 2+ progressive group, but there is heterogeneity. So among Black millennials, the mix is not significantly different than the predicted probability of being in the 2+ progressive group. So I will kind of wrap everything up. So what I've shown is that this aggregate stability in preference between children, on one hand, has been maintained, but it's also changed in some important ways. So this norm has shifted in some important dimensions, and I think this is important because understanding these patterns of heterogeneity are important for sort of our understanding of social change more broadly. So this is consistent in some respects with the second demographic transition. So millennials are more likely to embrace a two-child norm that's characterized sort of by this increased gender egalitarianism, a decoupling of sex from marriage, increased secularism. But I think it also supports critiques of this as an incomplete theory. So we've seen higher religiosity alongside egalitarianism in a way that's not predicted by the second demographic transition, and of course, perhaps higher preferences for family sizes than we might expect. So the question remains, I think, whether changes in the social meaning of this two-child norm will matter for eventual childbearing. And, it raises a question about what does it mean that younger cohorts are increasingly embracing this family ideology that's more egalitarian, but may be sort of unable to implement these ideas in practice. And here I think it's a useful place to think about this in the literature on gender inequality and fertility, and particularly these arguments that increasing equity in individual-oriented institutions like education and the labor market that persist alongside enduring gender inequities in family-oriented institutions like the home may correspond with low fertility. I think the next step is to think about what this will look like in the context of COVID. So certainly there's already work suggesting there has been, this COVID baby bust, so to speak. And I have done some preliminary work with another rotating panel with the GSS that suggests that, there's actually been fairly limited impact of COVID on people's preferences. So I think this raises some interesting questions going forward if we're thinking about unrealized fertility as a recurring phenomenon, particularly for cohorts that have experienced sort of both the Great Recession and COVID. So I'm just going to end there, and I look forward to your comments.
Thanks. Thank you. That was a really good talk, and I learned a lot from it. Obviously, you've got many different measures and ways of sort of getting at this problem, which gives a sense of confidence in the robustness of the problems. But I did just want to ask about the ideal family size measure. So I'm not sure how that question is operationalized in the GSS or what the options are. But what struck me is that the question asks about what is the ideal family size for a family, not for your family,
right.
Which in some ways is good for capturing norms,
right.
But on the other hand, there might be more people who sort of say, well, I don't know what's appropriate for a family. That kind of depends on the family and who they are. So I'm wondering if there were any patterns in terms of non-response or don't know answers, and that increasing over time, especially, whether millennials are more likely to say, just not answer or say no.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's a great point about how that question is asked, because it does get asked slightly differently in different iterations of surveys, and sometimes it's more speaking to a broader norm, and sometimes it's, in your opinion, if you could do things differently. From what I've seen with the non-response actually goes down among millennials, and non-response is a real issue for a question like ideal family size. When you adjust, though, in this data for the sampling weight, it's actually fairly negligible. So I haven't done that much with it so far, but I think it is a good point, and particularly when we're talking about uncertainty, perhaps playing a role in people having concrete decisions. And I agree that it's probably something that I should look more into more seriously.
In similar spirit, so life is full of trade-offs, and family life in particular. And the ideal family size doesn't capture it. So I guess I'm pushing back. If you really think this ideal family size captures how many children you would have in the kind of, I could have it all in the world, where there are no trade-offs, then it's really not clear it should change due to the Great Recession or COVID, because that all these events change the trade-offs in the place. But if you ask ideal family size, it kind of takes all of these trade-offs away. So I never quite figured out how much to make of ideal family size, because at the end of the day, it depends on how much are you willing to trade off wages, time, income, what have you. And at least one way of listening to this question there are no trade-offs. You can have it all. How many children you will have. And if you were to adopt that perspective, I would expect any effects of the Great Recession on that or COVID and so forth.
Yeah, so I think it's like a very valid point, and in an ideal world, there would also be questions about shorter term preferences, and in part, that's part of the reason I brought in the information about intentions, because I think intentions are perhaps a little more flexible to the type of critique you raise. But I do think that there's something useful from kind of a normative perspective about what ideal family size captures and about whether there are these kind of, bigger picture changes in what the normative response is to that question. And I think, the question of whether or not these big events affected ideal family size, I do think that the fact that we do see some movement, for example, for unemployed women or, for people who are experiencing the Great Recession towards the end of their reproductive years, I think is evidence that it perhaps is more malleable and sensitive to these types of events than we might suspect. In a way, the fact that I do find overall null results kind of becomes it becomes very easy to say like, oh, well, maybe there just never would be anything that affects it, but I think there clearly are events, and one thing that I'm thinking through is the extent to which, maybe something like the Great Recession kind of doesn't, on average, affect ideal family size, but if you personally go through something during the Great Recession, like a important change in your employment status, maybe there are effects, and maybe there's some more thinking through we need to do about how sort of individual experiences are different than sort of these cohort level experiences. So, sorry, that was a bit all over the place, but this is something that's actively thinking through. I think
That's sort of related to that. Is there any evidence, thankful and I don't know, but both completed cohort fertility and earlier ideal family size that could capture some of these? Do we have any evidence on that ideal family size is at all related to completed fertility?
Yeah, so it's certainly, there is a big literature on that, and there's a lot of debate, and I would say, the overall indication is that they are correlated, though not perfectly, and there's some interesting evidence, I think, that suggests, there's a lot of evidence looking at how ideal family size is sort of a malleable measure that can change over the life course and so on. But I think the general consensus is that ideal and actual fertility are correlated, though not perfectly. That being said, there's debate about the directionality, about the extent to which changing ideals predict behaviors or whether behaviors change and people sort of readjust their ideals. Yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting. Now, I wanted to ask about other measures like, for instance, tolerance for childlessness. I ask in class every time. I ask how many kids are going to have, and this is the first time that I actually have some kids saying that they're not planning on having any kids. And you look at the average, but maybe there's something about the range that has changed, and I think that's because it's a little bit like divorce and marriage. Nobody would say that divorce is an ideal thing to do. reach everybody, but how willing are people to sacrifice something just to stay married? In the deinstitutionalization of marriage analysis, I thought they had a variable or a question that was like, do you think you should put up with an abusive husband just to protect marriage? If you could find, I didn't see in your variable something about divorce, or tolerance to divorce, which could be also a hint of, I tolerate one child, even though I still think it's better to have two, I have more tolerance for these other things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I'm not sure, I was trying to find a measure on divorce, and I'm not sure that part of the strength and the weakness of the GSS are the opinion questions, but there are a lot of really interesting opinion questions that only get asked in, one or two waves, so if you're trying to look over time, it becomes harder to use them. But I think, when you break it down proportionally by, number of people who expect, whose ideal is 0 children and so on. So it's interesting because very few people report an ideal of 0, but a much higher proportion will report an intention of 0. So I think there is definitely something interesting there, and I wonder if, in particular, as more data is released, and right now in the GSS there aren't enough respondents in sort of Gen Z to really look at, but I'm actually curious about what will happen in subsequent cohorts.
Question in the back?
A lot of my read is that there's been, for millennials, where the fertility has dropped right after the Great Recession. Some of what's happening is like a disrupted life script, where they had an idea about home ownership before they had kids, for instance. I'm wondering if there's any home ownership variables or things related to like neighborhood, where you live, things like that in the GSS. It seems like it'd be very easy to test.
Yeah, I think that's actually a fabulous idea, and I am not sure off the top of my head, but I think that's a great idea, and I'll certainly look into that.
So I have seen studies on ideal versus intended fertility, but most of them focus on women. So since in your analysis you combine both males and women, so can you tell us a little bit more about gender differences?
Yeah, so I think gender differences, so in a lot of respects, part of the reason I've pooled is because at least so far, I haven't found huge gender differences. That being said, there are a few gender differences, and in particular, there are some subpopulations where there are, so for example, in the intended family size measure, when you start limiting it by gender and race and ethnicity, so there are groups where there's some divergence between men and women, with men having higher, specifically, I think it's black men have higher intended family size than black women. But I think by and large, I didn't find many other interesting patterns by gender. But it is certainly something, I'll say the other, I think, to the extent that I do see impacts in the Great Recession work, it tends to be concentrated among women, either, older women or women who are unemployed. So I think those are interesting spots where there are gender differences. The fact that I'm not seeing big gender differences might be an interesting finding in itself, and definitely worth thinking through a bit more seriously.
Michelle.
Thanks for the presentation. Based on your result thus far, are you in the camp of those who believe that fertility will go up in the US, or it will stay at that level? And that question has gained particular relevance recently with this debate about population new population projections by HME, where you have the UN that does factor in some kind of rebounding or increase in the TFR in the decades to come, as opposed to just HME that just stay at this low level that we're observing now. So I was wondering what the implications of what exams of that would be.
Yeah, that is the important question. And it's definitely something I'm still thinking through sort of the so what. I mean, I think the kind of note I ended on the end is, you know, thinking through, and part of me is reluctant to sort of extrapolate too much, you know, based on people's and preferences and so on. But I think in a way where I'm coming is a bit more pessimistic in the sense that if people, if the extent of having 2 children now means a very particular set of comes with a particular idea about what family life will look like that's increasingly hard to realize in light of, lack of social safety net or, options that can better lead to sort of redistribution of care burden within the household and so on. What will that mean for people's abilities to put into practice their ideals? I think I would assume it kind of would lead to a less rosy projection about what may happen in spite of, higher preferences, but I'm a little hesitant to extrapolate too much.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I really appreciated the way you built up your argument. My question is related to your last answer and to the question about life scripts. I'm curious about if you have data on people's ideals of when they would start the family that would lead them to have the ideal family size. And so I think one of the common narratives about millennials and the Great Recession is that the generation is often delaying marriage, delaying childbearing, and I could see there being implications or there being differences between their ideal family size and what their realized fertility is. So when it comes to your question about sort of the implications of is there unrealized fertility, I'm wondering if that's something that has changed over time, if people's ideal time to start a family has changed over time, and how that relates to some of the measures you looked at.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should look, I'm not sure that the GSS has it, but it could be the NSFG has something that would get closer to it. And I think, yeah, that's absolutely a great thing to look at as a next step. So what are people's sort of mental maps of what an ideal time frame looks like, in addition to these sort of these bigger picture narratives of what might an ideal, family look like, so to speak.
Do we have time for one more question, please?
I was just interested in, especially in light of the traditional views versus the progressive views, if you looked at any regional differences or even just occupational differences, if you are looking, maybe that's where some of that gender heterogeneity would derive from.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I haven't yet. So far I've looked at kind of just the variable and demographic predictors. But I think regional differences would be interesting. Rural versus urban, certainly interesting, and definitely occupation. So those are all things that would be the next step.
So we still have 1 more minute left, so I have one more question.
So just sort of picking up on something that Behrman touched on, that we sometimes adjust our ideal for what we've actually done.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get my head around how actual fertility might be constraining some of these changes. So if you ask me at time 1 and time 2 around the recession what my ideal family size is, if at time 1 I already have 3 kids, it's going to be really hard for me to say my ideal family size is 2, or it's going to be really hard for me to change that over time. So is there any way to pull out people who, to only look at people who are childless at time 1, or does that shape your
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we're looking at something like ideal family size, this like ex post facto rationalization is definitely a recurrent issue in looking at the data. And it kind of gets at questions about this initial point Wendy brought up, which is this a bigger, people answer as kind of like a bigger social norm, like what's the ideal in general versus what's the ideal for me. But even if it's the former, it might be hard to report a child as unwanted. So it is possible to pull out people with children, and I haven't done it, but I have done some more, in the rereading, or, I've also done some decomposition work that does account for current parity, and I agree that that is something important to take into account.